Good morning, Darrell.
Yeah, I didn't get to see it.
All right, some of these nations have errors. Good morning, everybody. 27, 2, 7, 8, 9. It is the next to the last Sunday in September. So, okay, I'll get to that. We're on page 407.
407.
Thank you, Rob.
And so we are continuing with First Corinthians section, about 2/3 of the way down the book. So it starts with authenticity. So affirmation of the existence of this letter appeared early on in the Bible, or not in the Bible, but in historical time. We're on page 407. So around AD 95, Clement of Rome wrote to Corinthians concerning the existence of a rebellious spirit in the church. And he too referred to Paul's letter about their spirit, and that's in 95 AD, asking them to take up the epistle that Paul wrote them and act on it, right? So that's the same type of comment that we would have today. If it's addressed, an issue is addressed, then all these years later, it's still being addressed. And the thing about that is, even if we address an issue, let's say we have a similar issue, right? And so a rebellious spirit. So we address it in the church, it's resolved. Well, you know what will happen in just a short amount of time? A rebellious spirit comes back. So these things are, not to say that it wasn't addressed and then came back up, and that Clement is readdressing it, but bear in mind, church issues are not solved and they never come back. They may be solved for years, they can be solved for decades, but as people die off, we'll just say it that, we have a church body, right? So in the last 10 years or 12 years, think of how many people we used to have that did functions in the church that are no longer present. And so church itself is dynamic. It's changing, because as it changes, we have those people who were pillars in the church, if you will, and they were anchors, and then they pass. And now we have other people that are hopefully just took over that need or that position, but the idea is the church is always alive. It's always growing. And so there's a certain segment that's always passing away and a certain segment of new people. So hitting on discipleship, and I talked to the youth group about this one time. I said, in 10 years, this whole church is yours. It's paid for. It has a current membership. Are you guys and girls prepared to take it over? Do you know the foundations of Christianity? Could you talk to somebody about it? Do you know why we do communion, much less how we do communion? Do you know? So there's all of these knowledge transfer, right? That's what we talk about at work. So if as people really, you're like, that person is a pillar in the church, he's always there, she's always there, and they're doing this and that, then the question is, how is that knowledge being transferred to everyone else so that when they leave, it's just not a gap? And so that's what we do in discipleship. We're trying to pass on that. How do we do church? What do we believe? How do we reach the lost? Because I'm sure everyone has had probably an experience where you're at work and you have, like, Miss Sue has been here as the secretary for 42 years, right? And she leaves, and everyone's like, does anyone know how she ordered that? Does anyone know who she contacted? anyone know the secret password to our bank account? Right? So knowledge transfer, we'll do it like in my house. It is not always ongoing, but as a backup, we have the 1950 style 3x5 card box, right? So within that, I'm hoping, and it's like that thick. It's not like it is like, I jammed one more in there. Maybe we should buy another one. Oh, and they get laid on top now because they you can't fit, but maybe there's enough gap between the top of them and the top of the bottom of the lid. Because like for me, um, if I were to go, it would be transparent. Say again?
Are you saying that yours are not in alphabetical order?
No, they're in there and they are. She has A, B, C, D. Yes, they are. And if you mess it up, there's spot checks that go on, right? That's, you don't put that one there. I'm like, I'm sorry. So, but that is important because whoever has all the knowledge, when they go, then it affects the home. At church, if we have only several people that do everything, when they go, no one knows. I'm like, I wish we had asked them before they departed, this, and this. So even simple things like email, right? So I'm all for transparency. And so I even tell my wife, just go through my email and delete the 2,000 things I haven't read. If you want to read any of it, she's like, no, it's yours. But if I have a question, like you get an update, you're like, it asks for my password, right? So what do I have to do? I have to go back to the box and go, can you tell me my password? So in business, we have a process at work for a turnover that would occur in your absence, right? We have this knowledge transfer already put in binders and that. But at church, we don't really look at it the same way, and we should. And that is, part of discipleship, and it's part of being an organization, right? And we are a church, we're the body of Christians here, but the reality is, um, if the budget person, something happened to her, we laugh about it. Does everyone know what bank we go to? Does just to do to walk in and we're like, hey, we're from Northside and I understand we have a bank account here. Can someone help us? So, but that goes back to things change, and even when we address an issue like Paul did, it doesn't mean the issue goes away. And so we see Clement addressing an issue. And so issues come and issues go, but it's guaranteed that issues never go away. Because here we are 2,000 years later, and if we were doing church well, you would think we would have it down. We would go to church. We would all be loving. We would all be caring. We would all be pitching in. We would all be reaching the lost. We would all be, but no, every time we get a new member, it starts just like Christ left, right? And we have to start with a new member and go, this was the Messiah. He came, he did this, let's read about it. And this is what we are to do as Christians, right? So that thing, that just because Clement of Rome wrote in 95 AD doesn't mean that it even ended then. It's an ongoing, how do we address church issues? And so Clement went on to rebuke the church for allowing the persistence of a contentious spirit, to which Paul had first reference. So both in the early church and the modern church have accepted 1 Corinthians as genuinely Pauline, because even as early as 95 AD, there was somebody that wrote and said, look, you got the original letter from Paul. Now here we're writing you again to say it's either come back or you never fully addressed it. So the date and provenance. So here we've the 1 Corinthians is actually, as we know, Paul's second letter to Corinth. He's we don't have the first one, but he did write it because he mentioned a first one. So he wrote it from Ephesus during his third missionary trip. And Paul was nearing the end of his stay in the city, for he was making plans to leave, and we see that in 1 Corinthians 15. Some have suggested that Timothy carried the letter, so it's not explicit, but 1 Corinthians 16. But this is uncertain. So the date of the letter would probably be 55 or 56. So now we see they received the letter, and let's say for easy math, 55, and now 40 years later, somebody else is writing saying, you know, that problem still exists. So the thing to think about is the initial people who had the problem were adults. 40 years later, they're probably not even alive. 40 years later, they're writing the church to say, you guys still have the same problem. So, you know, keep that in mind. So that letter, there's at least 40 years, 41 years gap. And so all the adults, like if we had a problem now, unfortunately, I can be pretty certain in 40 years, I'm probably not here. Right. So that audience, the same way back then, is not going to be the same audience. So the occasion of the letter, two features contributed to the writing of 1 Corinthians. So here we have a big first. First, Paul received from the servant Cleo a report about disagreements in the church. And we see that right in chapter 1, verse 11. That's addressed pretty quick. Second, he received a letter from the church requesting information about certain issues of practical and doctrinal significance. And we see that in, chapters 7, 8, 12, 15, and 16. And perhaps the three men mentioned in 1 Corinthians 16:7 brought the letter from the church. So I don't want to make it sound like Corinthians is totally, we're going to cover some things that they did. They were not good, right? Absolutely. They were not good. But the same way, when you go to a doctor, and I know we're all probably guilty of this. My wife's not, of course, but I would be. That is when the doctor says, you need to take this 3 times a day at like 6 noon and 6 p.m., right? And even when you feel better, you better not stop taking it. And you have to do it for 2 weeks. So what do you do when you start feeling good on day 3? I think I'm cured, right? A lot quicker than that doctor thought. I probably don't need to take this stuff anymore. And so, we have to follow the directions, right? We have to follow the guidance we receive. Now, here on that, and that's why I bring it up, because the church is sick. And we're going to see how sick they are. They're spiritually not well. But they're not walking away. There is enough maturity in the church to say to Paul, we're a church, we have all these problems, we have a whole group of people in here, and we have all these things going on. What should we do? And Paul kind of, when he talks to them, writes that they should already know what to do, right? But he's going to address it. So that receiving a report and receiving a letter, at least the Corinthian church still cared enough about following Christ to go back to Paul and say, can you address these problems? We're looking for someone who's a mature Christian who would be an authority, like an apostle, right? Tell us how we should do this, because obviously internally they can't come to an agreement on what they should do. So it's not all bad. Their conduct is bad, but to their plus point is they know it too, and they're trying to reach a what should we do. So now we're going to go on to introduction. Paul's opening address to the Corinthians followed the traditional pattern of A and B greetings that we've previously discussed. Paul gave a Christian twist on this segment of the salutation and followed his salutation with his normal expression of thanksgiving for the church, right? So you could be a really bad, we have all sorts of problems, church. But if you're trying to get better, then yes, Paul is investing. He wants them to become a productive, functioning church. So he greets them, right? So notice that Paul expressed gratitude for God's work among the Corinthians rather than the performance or actions of the Corinthians themselves. So he's not telling them, you guys are doing an outstanding job of being a church, right? But he does say he's glad that God is working among the Corinthians, and God, in working among them, have moved these people to say, we need to ask really what we need to do. And so, when we talked about having somebody you're accountable to, if you have somebody you're accountable to in your personal life, then hopefully it's such a relationship that you could go to them and say, I think I'm messing up. I don't know if I'm doing this right. I think this is what I'm doing. And this is, I think it's kind of okay. And that other person can say, well, let's look and see what God says, right? And then they can address it with you. And so now we see a church trying to hold themselves accountable, and they internally can't do it. So they've gone to Paul, which is a great, I mean, that's a real, that's why he's grateful for God's work among the Corinthians. They're going to ask about it. So number one, factions. Now these, we're going to see some things here. Factions in the church. Have the church stopped splitting into other church when there's an argument? No, right? Do they always subdivide over a doctrinal issue? Like,
No.
this is absolutely right. This is absolutely no. God said it right here. No. So
Called up a judge and wanted to change the law.
Yeah.
yes, Shag is coming back.
Yes.
We can get it right now at a cheap price,
With 2 free rakes.
and we can put in Shag now. In 5 years, we will be on top of that wave of. We will be right there at the top of in style. Kind of an echo in here anyway.
Carpet will go up in value.
Yes, and we could put Shag on the walls. I always loved that in the basement, right? Sound dampening. You could vacuum that baby right there, right? Get away from that little dusting stuff that we don't like anyway. And so, yes, so something as inconsequential as the carpet, and the church will divide. So this whole factions within the church, we don't want to look at it and go, look at those people, right? We need to go, oh, are we those people? So now the factions develop for different reasons. Now this is what we see in the Corinthian church. The factors develop from loyalty to personalities rather than to Jesus, right? And that's what we're going to see. They all of a sudden polarized and said, well, I follow Paul, I follow Christ, and I follow Apollos. And we have this going on, and Paul's going to address it. So Paul even depreciated the loyalty of those who professed allegiance to him in 13. Paul doesn't want church members loyal to him. What happens when Paul dies? Do they just give up going to church because who they were following left? So Paul is not spreading a gospel about following him. He's talking about following Christ. Those who followed Apollos might have been attracted by his eloquence, and we see that in chapter 18. Peter probably appealed to those who were more legalistic in their attitudes, and the Christ party probably represented a group of believers who view themselves as more spiritual than others. We are the in the know group. And so, so that caused division in itself. So Paul now is going to address those issues. So Paul highlighted 3 factors that contributed in the factions in the church. Number 1, misunderstanding the nature of the gospel. So we see that in 118 to 3:4. That's a pretty good chunk of letter dedicated to what is the nature of the gospel. Number 2, misunderstanding the nature of the ministry. And we see that from 3:5 to 4:5. And then human pride in 4:6 to 13. And so doing the nature of the gospel. In explaining the nature of the gospel, Paul pointed out the need to understand its contents. So I put a note. I underlined understand its contents. You won't know, and then I put in parentheses what is said or what it means on parentheses unless you have your own Bible study. So if you don't understand the content of the Bible, there's two aspects to that. Have you studied on your own? And when you studied on your own, when you found something, you're like, I don't know about this. I just don't know. Then did you go to somebody and ask? Did you go to somebody and say, what does this mean? And so not understanding its content probably is the first issue still in the church. If you don't know what the Bible says, you don't know what God wants. And he insisted that the central theme of the gospel was the cross of Christ, right? The whole New Testament is about the Messiah coming. And then the Messiah came, the Messiah died, the Messiah rose. We have new life in Christ. And now we have the Bible telling us how we live that new life. What did Jesus want? What's the expectations? So the message was a contradiction to the Jews who could not conceive of a crucified Messiah. So the message was folly to the Gentiles who refused to regard a divine someone too weak to prevent a horrible death, such a horrible death as the crucifixion. So the Messiah is coming, and we think he's going to free us from we know what the Bible said, but now we're understanding it as we're going to be a free country again, and those Romans are out. But that's not what Christ was doing. He was he was making a means for us to have a relationship with God that we haven't had since the fall of the first sin. In the garden, in Adam and Eve, God walked with them.